Welcome to Murder Files 101. Tonight, we open one of America's coldest and most unsettling cases, the Long Island serial killer. 11 victims. One stretch of sand, years of silence. This isn't just a mystery, it's a landscape of unanswered questions, a shoreline where every tide seemed to carry secrets. Picture Gilgo Beach, a quiet barrier island off Long Island's southern coast. Summer cottages, fishermen, and the Atlantic breeze define its charm. But beneath that normalcy lay a darker reality. Tell me, as you listen tonight, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? The victims were young women, most in their 20s. Some were mothers, many worked as escorts, their lives intersecting through fragile lines of survival and silence. They were vulnerable, often dismissed by society, but someone hunted them, one by one, and left them arranged like grim markers in the sand. It began in December 2010, when police searched for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert. Instead of finding her, they discovered 4 other bodies along Ocean Parkway, wrapped, bound, and decaying in the brush. The pattern was undeniable. The island had been concealing a predator who knew its terrain well. The 4 women became known as the Gilgo 4. Each had advertised online services. Each vanished after appointments, and each ended up abandoned within yards of each other. This wasn't chance. The killer had a method, an invisible hand that moved within familiar ground, striking unseen and leaving silence behind. As days passed, search teams widened their sweep. That's when more bodies appeared. 7 additional remains scattered across the dunes and marshes. 11 lives extinguished. 11 mysteries bound together by sand and time. The scale was staggering. The shoreline became less a beach, more a graveyard whispering with Atlantic winds. Investigators pieced together fragments, phone records, surveillance, whispers of clients who never gave real names. But the killer's discipline stood out. Calls traced to burner phones, appointments arranged with chilling precision. Whoever this was, they weren't reckless. The scene, they understood distance, anonymity, and how to vanish without leaving fingerprints in daylight. The Gilgo 4 shared haunting similarities, but the other victims differed. A toddler, a young Asian male, a dismembered torso. Was it one killer or several? A dumping ground for Long Island's shadows? Or the work of a single orchestrator? The uncertainty only deepened the cold weight of the mystery. Shannon Gilbert, whose disappearance sparked the search, was eventually found a year later, her body submerged in a nearby marsh. Police claimed her death wasn't linked to the others, calling it accidental drowning. Yet many questioned this. Shannon's frantic 911 call painted another picture: terror, pursuit, and someone refusing to let her leave. The case quickly attracted national attention. 11 bodies along one road could not be ignored. Media swarmed, headlines screamed, but answers remained scarce. Families gathered in grief, clutching photographs and demanding justice. For them, these weren't sex workers or unknown remains. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, lives erased with cruel precision. Ocean Parkway itself became symbolic. 13 miles of asphalt bordered by sand, water, and dense brush. A highway that seemed ordinary by day, but by night carried a chilling aura. Patrol cars sat with headlights on, engines idling, as though the land itself might reveal the secrets it had swallowed. Local law enforcement struggled. Suffolk County Police were accused of corruption, secrecy, and incompetence. Allegations swirled that internal politics stalled the investigation. Some whispered the killer might even have connections within law enforcement itself. Distrust grew. For families of victims, every silence from officials felt like complicity in the crime. Despite thousands of tips, the case dragged on. Years passed, bodies lay buried, suspects surfaced and vanished, and the killer's identity remained obscured. Detectives traced leads through cold call records, vehicle sightings, and fragments of tape, but every new clue seemed to collapse into shadows before answers could be found. The case became less about solving murders and more about surviving time. Families aged, children grew without mothers. 11 lives became headlines, then files, then dust. But the killer still walked somewhere, shopping for groceries, filling gas tanks, blending into suburban anonymity, carrying the knowledge of what lay beneath the sand. This is the story we'll follow tonight. The victims, the suspects, the botched leads, and the chilling possibility that one man turned a beach into a graveyard. The Long Island serial killer remains unsolved. 11 victims, one beach of secrets, and the silence of the Atlantic still lingers, waiting. Every murder mystery begins, not with the killer, but with those whose lives were stolen. The Gilgo Four, as they came to be called, became the central focus of the investigation. Each was a young woman, each had turned to online escort work as a way to survive, and each vanished under circumstances that felt routine at first, until their bodies were discovered together. Megan Waterman was just 22 years old, a young mother from Maine. She had struggled with difficult relationships, but those close to her remembered her as vibrant, tough, and fiercely protective of her daughter. On June 6, 2010, she left a Holiday Inn in Hauppauge, Long Island, after arranging a meeting through Craigslist. She never returned. For her family, the silence that followed was crushing. Melissa Bartholomew was 24, a woman who had moved from upstate New York to the Bronx in search of independence. She balanced her life between survival and small dreams of stability. In July 2009, she vanished after leaving to meet a client. Later, her younger sister began receiving cruel phone calls, taunting voices, some whispered, some mocking, suggesting Melissa was dead. The calls were traced to crowded areas in Manhattan, but the man behind them was never caught. These women were not faceless. They had names, histories, and people who loved them. Yet for the killer, they became targets chosen with deliberate intent. And when their bodies were left along Ocean Parkway, the pattern of a predator was written into the sand. Maureen Brainard Barnes was 25 when she disappeared in July 2007. A mother of two, she lived in Connecticut and occasionally worked as an escort to pay bills. Friends described her as funny and caring, someone who often masked her struggles with humor. She left for New York City one summer evening to meet a client and was never seen alive again. Her remains were the first among the Gilgo Four to be discovered in December 2010. Amber Lynn Costello was 27, living in North Babylon, Long Island. She, too, was a sex worker, caught between addiction and attempts at recovery. Neighbors recalled seeing her last on September 2nd, 2010. A man had picked her up outside her home, luring her with promises of money. That night, Amber disappeared into the shadows of Long Island and never came back. For investigators, the similarities between these women were chilling. They had vanished years apart, but all were young, petite, and connected through online ads. Each had vanished in plain sight, after meeting a stranger whose face no one could describe, whose name no one could trace. The killer seemed to thrive on anonymity, blending into a marketplace where people disappeared easily. He didn't need to chase them down or break into their homes. He simply made appointments, and when the meetings ended, the women became ghosts, their silence preserved until the sand gave them back. Beyond the Gilgo Four, investigators found other bodies along the same stretch of beach. Unlike the four, these victims did not share the same profile, complicating the investigation. One set of remains belonged to a woman known only as Peaches, identified by a peach-shaped tattoo on her torso. Found in 1997 in Hempstead Lake State Park, her body was linked to dismembered remains later discovered near Gilgo Beach. She had a child, a toddler whose body was also found among the dunes. To this day, their identities remain unknown, their stories pieced together only by fragments of bone and ink. Another victim was dubbed Asian Male, believed to be in his late teens or early 20s. Found dressed in women's clothing, his remains were discovered in 2011. Investigators could not confirm his identity, but his presence complicated the narrative. Was he part of the same killer's pattern, or evidence of another? These variations deepened the confusion. If the Gilgo Four pointed to a single meticulous predator, the other victims suggested multiple offenders, or perhaps one killer whose impulses shifted. The possibility unsettled investigators. It meant the beach wasn't just hiding one story, it was a burial ground for overlapping nightmares. Then there was Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose disappearance led to the entire investigation. On May 1st, 2010, Shannon, 24, was last seen running through the gated community of Oak Beach. She had been working as an escorted there by her driver for a client, but something went wrong. At 4:51 a.m., Shannon called 911. For 23 minutes, she begged for help, insisting someone was after her. Her voice was frantic, terrified. Dispatchers noted her words, "They're trying to kill me," but her location wasn't clear. Residents reported seeing her pounding on doors, screaming for safety, before vanishing into the marshland. 18 months later, her remains were found in that marsh. Authorities ruled her death as drowning, not murder. Yet her family and many experts disagree. To them, her final call was too desperate, too specific. Shannon had been running from something, or someone. Her death remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Was she another victim of the Long Island serial killer, or an unrelated tragedy? For families of the Gilgo Four, her cries for help echo like a warning that no one reached in time. Together, the victims formed a mosaic of tragedy. Some were identified, others remained nameless. But all were united by their fate along Ocean Parkway. 11 lives ended, clustered in a way that suggested intent. What unsettled investigators most was the geography. The remains were not scattered randomly. They were placed along a narrow corridor of road, shielded by tall reeds and scrub brush, easily accessible yet hidden from view. The killer, or killers, had chosen this place carefully. It was remote, but not isolated. It allowed quick access, swift disposal, and escape without notice. For the families, the location carried unbearable weight. Each trip to the beach meant standing among the same dunes where their daughters, sisters, or mothers had been discarded. For investigators, it meant untangling whether the victims were all tied to one shadow, or if the beach had simply become a silent graveyard for multiple predators over decades. By the time all remains were catalogued, the story had shifted. It wasn't just about the Gilgo Four, it was about a broader horror. A question that lingered in every briefing: was Long Island hiding one monster, or many? From the moment the first bodies were discovered, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer was fraught with challenges. Suffolk County Police faced immense pressure. 11 victims, one road, and a public demanding answers. But almost immediately, cracks appeared. Resources were strained, evidence mishandled, and internal politics clouded decisions. Phone records provided the first real trail. Melissa Barthelomew's sister received a series of chilling calls after Melissa's disappearance. The caller mocked her, admitted to killing Melissa, and kept his voice calm, almost calculated. Investigators traced the calls to crowded areas in Manhattan, near Penn Station and Times Square. The man had used prepaid burner phones, making detection nearly impossible. Yet the fact that he taunted the family suggested arrogance, or perhaps the need to savor his control. Surveillance in those areas turned up nothing. Cameras failed to catch him, and witnesses recalled no one suspicious. The case that should have exploded into progress collapsed again into silence. The killer was careful, meticulous. He knew how to stand in plain sight without being noticed. For investigators, this was the first indication that they weren't chasing a reckless predator, but someone disciplined, organized, and frighteningly patient. The investigation soon became as much about the police as it was about the killer. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer faced criticism for his handling of the case. Some officers believed he pushed the narrative of a single killer too quickly, while others thought he failed to act decisively enough. Complicating matters, the FBI was not brought into the case until years later. Local authorities resisted federal involvement, citing jurisdictional boundaries, but many saw this as pride, or worse, fear of exposure. Allegations surfaced that police corruption played a role in stalling progress. In fact, years later, Suffolk's own police chief, James Burke, would be imprisoned for assaulting a man who stole his duffel bag filled with pornography and sex toys. His history of corruption cast a dark shadow over the case. For families, this raised disturbing questions. Were their daughters' murders being mishandled intentionally? Was the killer protected by incompetence or by influence? Rumors spread of possible ties between law enforcement and the sex trade, of powerful men who may have crossed paths with the victims. Whether true or not, the whispers deepened the mistrust. In the end, the investigation became a war fought on two fronts: against a killer who vanished into the night, and against a police department drowning in its own secrets. Over time, several suspects emerged, though none were ever definitively charged with the Gilgo Beach murders. One of the earliest names was Dr. Peter Hackett, a resident of Oak Beach, where Shannon Gilbert disappeared. Hackett had called Shannon's mother after her disappearance, claiming he ran a home for wayward girls and had seen Shannon the night she vanished. Later, he denied making the call, though phone records proved he had. His behavior fueled suspicion, but no evidence tied him directly to the killings. Another figure was Joseph Brewer, the client Shannon had gone to meet before she disappeared. He was the last confirmed person to see her alive. Brewer insisted she ran from his home in panic, and there was no proof he harmed her. He remained under suspicion in the public eye, but investigators never linked him to the other victims. Then there were broader theories: a disgraced cop with inside knowledge, a local businessman with access to the marshes, or even multiple killers operating independently. Each lead carried weight for a time, then dissolved. Forensic evidence was scant, DNA degraded by salt and sand. The case became less about hard proof and more about speculation, theories layered on whispers, as the killer stayed hidden in the shadows of Long Island. The most persistent theory centered on a man known as the Long Island serial killer, or LISK, a shadowy figure believed to be responsible for the Gilgo 4, at minimum. The precision of the calls, the arrangement of the bodies, the consistency of the victims suggested one calculating predator. Behavioral profilers weighed in. They described a white male, likely in his 30s or 40s during the killings, familiar with Long Island, possibly working in a job that required travel or late-night freedom. He would appear ordinary, blend into suburban life, maybe even have a family. But beneath that facade, he carried knowledge of police methods and the discipline to avoid mistakes. Some profilers argued the killer lived nearby, perhaps in the wealthy enclaves along the South Shore. Others believed he worked in law enforcement or had military ties, given the control he demonstrated. To them, the taunting phone calls weren't slips. They were deliberate acts of dominance. He wasn't just killing, he was performing. The profile painted a chilling picture: a man who lived among ordinary people, who could stand in line at a supermarket, attend school events, or mow his lawn, all while hiding the fact that he had turned a stretch of beach into a cemetery. By the mid-2010s, the investigation had grown colder. Leads dwindled, families waited, and the beach remained unchanged, still carrying the weight of secrets. Public pressure waned as other stories took headlines, but the victims' families never stopped pushing. For them, justice was not optional, it was survival. Then, in 2016, a breakthrough seemed possible when new Suffolk County Police Commissioner Timothy Sinney reopened cooperation with the FBI. A task force was created, combining resources and expertise. Slowly, the case began moving again. Cell phone mapping offered renewed hope. The killer's burner phones had pinged towers in Massapequa Park, an area of Long Island that investigators began watching closely. The focus shifted from speculation to geography, narrowing the circle. But even with new technology, the identity of the killer remained elusive. The investigation stretched into years, dragging into a silence that felt eternal. 11 lives hung in balance. The question haunted every briefing, every headline: was the Long Island serial killer still out there, living an ordinary life, smiling at neighbors, hiding in plain sight? Or had the trail gone cold forever, the answers buried beneath the sand he had chosen so carefully? As the case dragged on, theories about the Long Island serial killer grew more complex. Some investigators believed in one singular predator responsible for all 11 bodies. Others argued there were at least 2, maybe more, using the same dumping ground. The differences among the victims fueled this debate. The Gilgo Four were similar, young women, petite, linked to escort services. But the others, including a toddler and a male dressed in women's clothing, didn't fit the mold. Behavioral profilers warned that killers rarely shift patterns so dramatically. That suggested multiple offenders. Perhaps Gilgo Beach had become a magnet, a place criminals knew was secluded enough to hide their crimes. This theory haunted the families. It meant their loved ones might not all have been victims of the same hand, but instead part of overlapping horrors, a graveyard, not for one killer, but for several. For investigators, the possibility was overwhelming. It expanded the scope of the case into something nearly unmanageable. Still, the precision of the Gilgo Four stood apart. Whoever arranged those bodies had a ritual, a cold structure. It was too neat, too deliberate, to dismiss. And if there was one predator, he was still at large. In 2020, new leadership within Suffolk County reignited momentum. A digital evidence review began, using modern analytics unavailable a decade earlier. One of the breakthroughs came from revisiting old cell tower data. Investigators tracked patterns of burner phones used to contact the victims, mapping pings to specific regions of Long Island. Those patterns converged in Massapequa Park, narrowing suspicion to a handful of possible residents. The killer had likely lived or worked there, moving through neighborhoods, attending barbecues, perhaps even waving at police patrols, while carrying the burden of unspeakable crimes. DNA technology also advanced. Hair fragments recovered from the burlap wrappings were tested using modern genealogy techniques. Though degraded, one strand provided a genetic lead, pointing toward a family line investigators could trace. The science that once failed now provided a map. For years, families had begged for progress. Finally, they saw movement. But with progress came renewed fear. If the killer had gone quiet, was it because he felt safe, or because he was still out there, watching? As evidence piled up, suspicions began to settle on one man, Rex Heuermann, an architect, living in Massapequa Park, a tall, imposing figure in his late 50s. Heuermann seemed unremarkable to his neighbors. He lived in a modest home, commuted to Manhattan, and maintained the facade of an ordinary suburban life. But investigators uncovered disturbing details. Heuermann owned a collection of burner phones linked to the Gilgo Four. He had searched online for violent pornography, including themes eerily close to the victims' realities. His DNA, recovered through discarded pizza crust, matched genetic material found on one of the victims. Heuermann's arrest in July 2023 sent shockwaves through Long Island. After more than a decade of silence, a suspect had finally been named. He was charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo Four, and remained the prime suspect in the 4th. For families, it was a moment of grim validation. The killer had always been hiding in plain sight. Still, questions lingered. Were all 11 victims his, or only some? The diversity among the bodies suggested others may have been involved. Even as Heuermann faced trial, the broader mystery of Gilgo Beach remained unsolved. The arrest brought relief, but also unease. Heuermann had lived just miles from where the victims were found. His house sat on a quiet street, flanked by ordinary suburban homes. Neighbors described him as strange but unremarkable, a man who kept to himself, yet blended into the background. Inside his home, investigators discovered a disturbing collection: weapons, disturbing images, and hidden spaces, suggesting a double life. The very ordinariness of his public image made the revelations more terrifying. For years he had walked among his neighbors, raised a family, and worked in Manhattan, all while allegedly carrying the burden of death. This dual existence unsettled the community. If Heuermann could hide in plain sight, who else might? The case reminded Long Islanders that evil does not always appear monstrous. Sometimes it smiles at you in the supermarket, nods while mowing its lawn, or fixes your roof. The killer isn't always a shadow in the woods. It can be the man next door, For the families, this reality was unbearable. They had always feared the predator was close. Now those fears seemed horribly justified. Despite the breakthrough, the case remains far from over. Prosecutors work to solidify charges, while investigators comb through decades of unsolved murders for connections. The question of the other victims, the toddler, the male, the unidentified women, still lingers. Were they Horemans, Suvera, or is there another predator still out there? Theories continue to swirl. Some insist the beach was used by multiple killers. Others argue Horeman's profile fits only the Gilgo 4, leaving the rest unclaimed. The uncertainty gnaws at the edges of closure, reminding everyone that answers are rarely clean in cases this large. For now, Gilgo Beach stands as both a crime scene and a memorial. 11 victims, their stories bound together by geography and silence. The Atlantic still presses against the shore, erasing footprints but not memory. The sand shifts, but the weight of what happened there never moves. The Long Island serial killer case is closer to resolution than ever before. Yet the shadows remain, and the question still whispers on the wind. Is the true story fully uncovered, or does the beach still hide more secrets beneath its dunes? The story of the Long Island serial killer is not only about crime, it is about the failures, the silences, and the lives left behind. For the families of the 11 victims, the case is not a headline, it is a wound that never closes. Every holiday, every birthday, every empty chair at the table reminds them of what was stolen. Some families became advocates. They held vigils, walked the beach, and spoke at press conferences when the police fell silent. Others retreated, grieving quietly, away from the glare of media. Yet they all shared the same burden, knowing their daughters were dismissed by society because of the work they did. That dismissal allowed the killer to act in darkness. The case is as much about how we treat victims as it is about the man who killed them. Gilgo Beach became a place of pilgrimage for these families, not because it offered comfort, but because it offered truth. Standing there, they could touch the same sand where their daughters' last moments were erased. The waves carried no answers, but the shoreline forced acknowledgement. 11 lives mattered, even if the world tried to forget them. The Long Island serial killer case also left a mark on law enforcement. Suffolk County Police faced years of scrutiny and criticism. The corruption scandal involving former Chief James Burke became permanently tied to the case. His refusal to allow the FBI's early involvement raised suspicions that still linger today. For many observers, the handling of the case exposed systemic flaws, how pride, politics, and secrecy can cripple an investigation. Had the FBI been allowed in sooner, could the killer have been caught earlier? Could some victims still be alive? These questions remain unanswerable, but they echo in every report written about the case. At the same time, the case pushed advancements in forensic technology. Genealogy databases, once used primarily for family trees, became tools for solving crimes. What once seemed impossible, finding a killer through degraded DNA, suddenly became reality. The breakthrough in 2023 that led to Rex Hoeman's arrest proved that persistence and evolving science could finally pierce through decades of silence. Yet the legacy of failure sits beside the progress. The case will always remind investigators that every delay costs lives, and every ignored victim gives predators more room to move. For the community of Long Island, the case changed the way people looked at their neighborhoods. Gilgo Beach, once a quiet retreat, became infamous. Ocean Parkway turned into a corridor of death in the public imagination. Even today, locals describe a shift in atmosphere. Where once the dunes were places for picnics and fishing, they became reminders of what the land had hidden. Neighbors of Rex Hoeman struggled with shock. Some said they never suspected him, that he seemed like just another suburban father. Others admitted they found him odd, but nothing more than that. The ordinariness of his presence was the most disturbing fact. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in the woods. He was a man who lived in plain sight, surrounded by normalcy. This realization unsettled not just Long Island, but anyone following the case. It stripped away the illusion that killers are always visible, Always strange, always apart. The truth was colder. Sometimes the predator blends in so well that no one notices until the graves appear. That truth still lingers over the community, a quiet dread that ordinary streets can hide extraordinary horrors. Culturally, the Long Island serial killer case became a symbol of unresolved fear. Documentaries, books, and podcasts dissected every detail. The victims' names entered public memory, not through justice, but through tragedy. For many, the case became a cautionary tale about technology. The rise of online escort ads, the anonymity of burner phones, and how predators adapted to new tools. But beyond the headlines, the story resonates because it is unfinished. Even with Rex Hoerman's arrest, too many questions remain. Were all the victims his? If not, who else used the beach as a graveyard? Will the unidentified victims ever have names? The uncertainty creates a haunting legacy. Unlike solved cases that offer closure, this one lingers in the imagination. The dunes are still there, the ocean still washes over the sand, and somewhere within that rhythm lies the silence of those who will never speak again. Every retelling of the case carries that silence. It is not only a mystery, it is a reminder of what remains hidden, and how easily horror can live just beyond the edges of what we choose to see. Today, the Long Island serial killer case continues to evolve. Courtrooms prepare for trial, families prepare for testimony, and investigators comb through evidence with modern tools. But even if Rex Hoerman is convicted, the case will not end neatly. Too many victims remain unanswered, too many years lost to secrecy. The beach itself remains unchanged. Visitors walk the same stretch of sand, unaware of the weight beneath their feet. The marshes whisper with the same winds that once carried silence over hidden graves. For those who know, Gilgo Beach is not simply a place. It is a grave marker carved by the Atlantic itself. The legacy of the case lies not only in who the killer was, but in how the victims are remembered. They were more than headlines. They were women with families, a child with a future, lives that mattered even when the world overlooked them. The Long Island serial killer left more than bodies behind. He left a question that will haunt Long Island forever. How many secrets can a beach hold before the tide finally gives them back? Some cases end with answers. This one doesn't. 11 victims, one beach, and a silence that still presses against the Atlantic wind. A man stands accused, but the shadows along Gilgo Beach remain. Remember this, predators don't vanish, they adapt, and sometimes they live closer than you think. This was Murder Files 101. Another case waits. Stay ready.